We are live back once again talking about ACC power rankings. Then we'll dive into Clemson deeper with a review of the Clemson's win over Florida State, and then we'll look ahead to the upcoming game against Wake Forest. To help us with the ACC power rankings, we have a guest this time, friend of the channel, Matt Golden. Matt, thanks for being here.
Yeah, glad to be back. Glad that we're celebrating yet another Clemson win, and look forward to kind of diving into these ACC power rankings. As it's been kind of an interesting year in the conference.
Yeah, it's I know Clemson's competition's been weak, post Georgia, but it feels a little bit like the old days here, where we're just going in expecting to win, kind of just relaxing as Clemson jumps out to 17-0 leads. Before we dive in, I figured I'd put on my trusty ACC hat, see if you can keep a straight face for this.
Oh man.
So let's dive right in, and as I'm sure you've seen, I've got these broken up into little sections. So let's start off with the bottom three. As some folks may know, Matt writes for Shaking the Southland, and we split the Q&As, and we also split the ACC power rankings. So sometimes we disagree, and you'll see a little bounce back and forth depending on who wrote it. So these are my power rankings, and Matt, you are more than welcome to tell me why I'm crazy and wrong and everything was terrible. And we'll start with the bottom three. So I finally moved Florida State to the bottom. At some point, record has to count, and they just keep losing games. So I've got them on the bottom. Since Clemson played them, I'll let you jump in right there.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that they when you've only won one game, and that's against a Cal team that we'll talk about a little later, it doesn't look like they're very, very good at all. I will say I expect them to kind of move up because I think Brock Glenn brings a lot to this offense that unfortunately DJ Uiagalelei did not. And this is not me hating on DJ. I went into this season saying I would pull for DJ to do well as long as Clemson beat him, and it has not really worked well for him. I know there's talks that he may take a medical red shirt and play for a 6th year. We'll see what happens with that. But on Saturday night, Brock Glenn looked so much better, and the FSU just looked better, even though they didn't look great. They're still probably not a bowl team, but I think that if you're FSU, you got to just keep rolling with Brock. And who knows, you might win 3 or 4 games and you kind of build toward the future. But yeah, I understand them being at the bottom. I don't know they're going to be at the bottom the whole season, but I think for right now it completely makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. We'll talk more about Florida State when we get into the Clemson review of them, but I definitely agree with you about Brock Glenn. Certainly quarterback wasn't the only problem, but I think Brock Glenn showed a lot more upside and maybe even more moxie than DJ. Above them, I have NC State. We can gloss over them quickly because we'll talk about them when we get to Wake Forest. But they blew a game against Wake Forest at home as 6-point favorites. I think they're just bad. I think we were just wrong. Florida State, NC State, obviously the 2 biggest disappointments in the conference by far. Really high hopes for both of them. Florida State was the media pick to win the conference, and NC State was thought to be at least a dark horse at minimum, sort of in the mix with Clemson, Miami, and Florida State. North Carolina, they actually had them a little bit lower last week. They were tied with Pitt in the 4th quarter. I know they lost at home, but I'm not really going to penalize them for that because I expected much worse.
Yeah, I think UNC, it doesn't get much worse than a few weeks ago when they had 70 put on them by James Madison. So, anything is going to be better than that. The fact that they were able to go toe-to-toe with a Pitt team that's undefeated. I was thinking about this earlier, and we'll talk more on Pitt later, but there's a possibility that maybe that Pitt-Clemson game in November is the game day. It's the game day that week. It could be a big ACC game. So for UNC to be able to kind of hold their own with them, even though it wasn't home, definitely shows some sign of life. I think this is it's a program that is it's really in the struggles. This is probably going to be Mac Brown's last year. I just cannot imagine seeing this going forward. It kind of reminds you of South Carolina at the end of the Spurrier years. You kind of think that he may retire, and they try to move to a different direction.
Yeah, he wasted 2 great quarterbacks. Now he doesn't have an NFL quarterback, and you see them just crash back down to earth. They got to part ways in a nice, mutual, kind of celebratory way. They can't let this go on. All right, so above them, 3 more teams. You got Cal and Stanford, the former Pac-12 teams, then sandwiched in between you have Wake Forest. Cal blew a 25-point lead, pretty ugly, but it also means they were up by 25 on Miami. Connected on some big plays, and maybe that speaks to Miami just as much as it speaks to them. They haven't beat any good teams, And it's not even in the same regard like Clemson, where they're blowing out mediocre teams. They're beating teams like UC Davis. They lost to 17th ranked Florida State. Their memes are funny, but I don't think their football team is good.
I would probably have Cal over Wake Forest and Stanford, just because I think Wake Forest not a very good team. I imagine we'll see Clemson kind of get back to form this weekend. We'll talk on that more later. Stanford, a second week in a row, they're just getting pummeled. This time at home by not good Virginia Tech. I think Cal's probably better than that. But you're right. I think this Cal team, there was a lot of overhype. I mean, I think they were a fun story. It's their first year in the ACC. Their fan base is quirky. They make AI generated memes on Twitter. It's great. I loved it. It's fun to watch, but I just don't think they're really all that good. And the fact that they blew a 25-point lead when they had everything going for them. They had probably the best crowd they've had at their stadium in years, and it's 2 a.m. Miami time. Those Miami guys are probably not looking sharp, or not. This is not Miami's a game that Miami should be able to play better than you in the late game, and yet they do. So yeah, I think Cal definitely toward the bottom of the conference. Again, I'd probably have them over Stanford, but I think we're splitting hairs with that.
Yeah, and to your point, Stanford, Virginia Tech goes all the way across the country. They're playing in a practically empty stadium. Really the reverse of Cal. I got to give Cal credit. At least their fans showed up. Stanford was empty, and they just, from start to finish, outplayed by a very okay Virginia Tech team. Now, in fairness, Stanford did not have quarterback Ashton Daniels, who gave Clemson fits with the run game. But you still can't lose like that. Just totally blown out. It was 31-7. It was playing at halftime. Stanford was non-competitive with, again, very whatever Virginia Tech team. Oh, and I don't want to gloss over this because I thought this was awesome. Did you catch the end? I don't think many people did catch the end. It was on the CW, the Wake Forest versus NC State game.
I did not. I ended up not getting to see the end of that game.
That was one of the most fun finishes. I tuned in at the end of whatever game was on before I flipped to it. Hey, I'll catch the end. There was maybe 6, 7, 8 minutes left. And Wake Forest is driving. They're down by 3. They've got a chance to win the game or take a lead. There's about 2 minutes left. And they start getting really conservative and running the ball and getting stopped. They're going to just settle for a field goal with, 90 seconds to go and lose this in overtime. And Dave Doran for NC State sees what they're doing and calls their bluff and starts burning timeouts. So after second down and third down, he burns timeouts. And then, of course, you have the 2-minute timeout. So he's going to leave himself enough time to go down and get the game-winning field goal after Wake makes the game-tying field goal. Dave Clawson calls the bluff, goes for it on 4th down, gets it on a pass play, and now there's plenty of time left, so they only have to go 20 yards and they have over a minute. So they work their way down, scores just a few seconds left, and C.J. Bailey throws a game-clinching interception on their very first play from scrimmage after that. So just a gutsy kind of – I thought Clawson was going to do something overly conservative. Instead, he goes for it, and it pays off. So good – I like to see, when I don't have a rooting interest, I sort of cheer for the coach who does things what I think is the right way. So I was happy to see him rewarded. Really fun finish. Obviously, unbelievably devastating for NC State to lose to their rival at home. Wake's not even good this year, so just brutal for them, but really fun.
Really fun. And, Dave Clawson, even in years that Wake is not good, they've been fun to watch. And I think if you're a Wake Forest fan, especially now in the NIL era, we saw, Sam Hartman, great quarterback, and then at the end ends up going to transfer to Notre Dame. You're not going to be able to keep guys like that. I think if you're Wake, if you're a Wake fan, you just want to be fun, and that's kind of what they are, even when they're bad.
Yeah, that rivalry, it's not some huge rivalry, but I'd say it's one of the more underrated ones. I've always enjoyed that game.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's keep moving. So then I have Duke at 11. They only have the one loss to Georgia Tech this week, but I had them at 17 to start the year. I don't really believe in them. I expected them to lose to Georgia Tech. I was almost surprised it was as close as it was. Final score in that one was Georgia Tech 24, Duke 14. But I don't think they're good. And then Boston College, I did sort of buy into it. Maybe, folks, I had them as high as I think 4 in these power rankings at one point, and folks were saying that's not high enough. Put them higher. It turns out they were kind of fraudulent. The win against Florida State was awesome at the time, and they got a lot of credit. But turns out Florida State's terrible. They lost close to Missouri, and that almost was like a quality loss. And after they just about lost to Vanderbilt, and then they turn around and they do lose in a blowout to Texas A&M. That loss looks kind of bad. They beat Michigan State, which seemed decent. Michigan State's now lost 3 in a row. So that resume got bad quick. I think Boston College is just very fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're middle of the road. They're nothing too special. They're not, they probably I think could be easily a bowl team. But yeah, I think we all got a little too excited. In the beginning of the season, you always have at least 1 or 2 of these ACC teams that kind of jump out, look good, and it's like, oh, is this going to be the surprise team? No, we know this is probably end up going to be a Miami Clemson championship game, and Boston College is very average.
And Duke at 11. Am I too low on them? Are you higher on Duke than I am?
I get what you're saying in that they didn't really play a whole lot of teams, but on the other hand, I mean, they're 5-0, or they were 5-0. A lot of teams, didn't. A lot of teams aren't doing that, which I will give them credit. It's just hard to know with this team. I also gotta say that Georgia Tech team's pretty solid. So I mean, it's not like it's a bad loss, but I would probably have them maybe a little bit higher just because this is their first loss. But yeah, I don't think they're necessarily anything great.
Well, here's the next 2. We got the 2 schools from Virginia Tech. I don't know if they've turned it around per se, but they've certainly looked better lately. And that Vanderbilt loss to start the season looked horrible. Vanderbilt's just probably maybe should have even beaten Missouri, and now they beat Alabama, one of the biggest upsets. I don't know, maybe one of the biggest upsets ever. So maybe that loss isn't so horrible. The Rutgers loss still looks kind of bad, but they're decent. And I'm starting to think that trip that Clemson takes to Lane Stadium is not a gimme. And then Virginia, they do what they did to Maryland, and now they turned around and or what happened to them against Maryland. They've turned around and now done it to Boston College. Virginia was very competitive with Maryland. Looked like they would win that game or at least take it down to the wire, shut out in the second half. They turn around and do that to Boston College, get 2 picks in the second half against Thomas Castellanos. Pretty solid win. Aside from Duke, I think I had Virginia either 16th or 15th in the ACC coming into the year. Didn't give Tony Elliott much of a chance, but look, he's winning games, and that team's not so bad.
Yeah, how about Tony Elliott? And I mean, I think this is really you're sitting at 4-1 with UVA. Definitely a team that I think is a pretty good chance to go to a bowl, which for them is huge. And for Tony Elliott, that's huge. Big matchup this week with the Louisville team that we are seeing isn't as good as we thought. We'll talk on them more later. But yeah, I'm excited. I'm kind of high on what Tony Elliott can do. Again, I don't think he's gonna, get them into the New Year's Six or anything, but there's a lot of good potential with them. That's been fun to watch. They've got a few former Clemson guys on that. So very happy to see that. Virginia Tech, still just don't know what to make of them. They did look rough early, and I don't know what to make of Vanderbilt. I mean, they just beat Alabama. They lost to Georgia State. I don't know what any of this means anymore. So Virginia Tech will be one to keep to watch. That game in Lane Stadium with Clemson, obviously, you always got circled because that's a tricky place to play. But they're starting to come around a little bit. But really high on what Tony Elliott and Virginia can do.
Yeah, and Virginia Tech, it feels like they've turned their season around, but it's not a ton. They started off 2-2 with losses to Vanderbilt and Rutgers, and their wins Marshall and Old Dominion, not great. They lost to Miami, so one of their last 2 games is a loss, but it came down to the wire, so you almost felt like it was a more victory of sorts. Then they blow out Stanford 31-7, so maybe they're starting to figure it out. Real test will be at home against Boston College, 7:30 ESPN game. I kind of think they're going to win. I mean, I have them higher in the power rankings of their home. So Georgia Tech, the Tech versus Tech game. So I think those will be big proving games before they go to Syracuse and then Clemson, which will both be really tough.
Yes, I think we'll know a lot more after that Boston College game. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. So these next 2, I think were kind of easy. Georgia Tech and Syracuse. Georgia Tech, like you said, I think they're actually good. They've got a really tough schedule, but I think they're a good team. Syracuse, they beat them head-to-head. Syracuse has a kind of bad home loss to Stanford, but nonetheless, they beat Georgia Tech. When Kyle McCord is on, they rely on him so heavily, but when he's good, he's really good, and they're pretty tough to beat.
Yeah, the Kyle McCord has been really great, and that was a fun game with them in UNLV. A pretty good little Friday night. get the weekend going. So that was great. Georgia Tech, I'm excited what I've seen from them. Obviously, they had a tough loss the other week to Louisville, but I really like what I have seen from Brent Key so far. I've told people this. I said he kind of gives me some of the vibes of the early tenure of Dabo. He's kind of he's a similar situation, interim coach, gets longtime assistant, gets promoted. And I just think he's a guy that kind of knows how to recruit, how to work the intricacies of working at Georgia Tech. So fun to see what he has. Do I think he's necessarily going to turn into what Dabo has turned Clemson? And that's a big stretch, but I think that there's a lot of positive momentum going on in Atlanta.
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick vignette about Georgia Tech. It's kind of cool. Our church is currently meeting in where he goes to high school, and someone was telling me that Georgia came in and said, "We'll give you an offer and we'll give you all this NIL money, but you need to gain some weight. Here's your exact target," and then the offer is good. So we thought about that, and then Georgia Tech came and Brent Key said, "I'll take you just as you are. I think you're great, and here's your huge NIL package." I think it was $500,000, and he cares about academics, so that's a huge plus. And he's at Georgia Tech, right? So over schools like Georgia, that's something.
Yeah, they are doing really well in the recruiting trail right now. I think Brent Key being a lineman coach is it's going to be an attractive place for a lot of those Metro Atlanta linemen. So, that could really be an interesting thing to watch over the next few years. It could be a place kind of how Dabo turned Clemson into wide receiver U. Georgia Tech might be offensive line U.
Yeah, I could see it. But the thing is, with a great offensive line, you start getting great running backs. If you remember Boston College from not too long ago, I think it was Andre Williams, if I'm remembering the name correctly. They built a great line, and they'd have these running backs just go crazy. So great comment here from Scott saying that Georgia Tech needs to limit the turnovers. They really kind of blew a game earlier this season just with silly turnovers, block punt, stuff like that. Up next, Georgia Tech has North Carolina on the road. That's the noon CW game, which should be a win. Then they get Notre Dame in the Benz. I think it's winnable. Here's
very winnable. Yeah, I think Notre Dame has looked pretty human and not particularly great. I think that's going to be a game that that'd be a huge win in the Benz for them. So that'll be a really interesting one to watch.
Yeah, and if you can get Notre Dame out of the playoff, that opens stuff up to likely get two ACC teams in the playoff, which is great. I'm sure the SEC would appreciate that as well. Another comment from Scott saying he agrees with the rankings, but Florida State and NC State will be ranked higher by the end of the year. I tend to agree with that, but at a certain point, I got to drop them if they keep losing. But if they played UNC or Duke, I'd probably pick them to win, right? So that'll probably play out. And I love some of these comments about Florida State. Florida State is too high in last place, or Florida State is overrated, is literally the worst team. So a lot of hate people are piling on for them, and fair enough there. All right, this is where we might have some disagreement. I'll pull back up. Next two, I have Pittsburgh undefeated at 5. I have 2-loss Louisville running a 2-game losing streak at 4. Let me explain myself, and then we'll see what you feel about that. Look, Pittsburgh, they keep winning games, but much like Duke, they're coming off a year where they were, Duke was fine last year, but Pittsburgh is coming off a year where they were horrible. And, they beat Cincinnati, but it was a very close win. Cincinnati's not good. And they needed a extremely fortunate disconcerting signals call on their game-winning drive to keep that alive and go win the game. They eke it out against mediocre West Virginia. Both of those saying there's a little bit of just good fortune in there, and they're kind of a middle to lower tier Big 12 kind of caliber. And then they struggled with North Carolina, and yes, they won, but you beat one of the worst teams in the ACC. James Madison, like you said, put up 70 on them, and you're tied at 24 going into the fourth quarter. So I'm still hesitant. Look, if they keep winning games, that Clemson game in November at Pitt, where Clemson's kind of struggled, is going to be a big showdown. But I'm not that scared about it. And then Louisville, they have a win over Georgia Tech, which is better than anything Pitt's done, in my opinion. I think highly of Georgia Tech. Louisville's loss to Notre Dame, almost fluky with all the turnovers. And then I think SMU's good. I watched that. That was the noon game I was watching before I flipped over to Wake Forest, NC State. And, their secondaries aren't great. They made some silly mistakes. But I thought both Louisville and SMU looked good. And I thought with Kevin Jennings, SMU looked really good. We'll talk about that in a minute. But your thoughts on my 4 and 5 here?
Yeah, I feel like Pittsburgh, it's almost the kind of almost anti-Florida State thing in that I think they're worse than their 5-0 record, but when they're 5-0, you can't not have them in the top 5.
Right.
So we'll kind of see this weekend against Cal should be interesting. I know I'm a little higher on Cal than you are, and I think, it will tell me a lot about Cal, how Cal responds after just this completely heartbreaking loss to Miami. So, if Cal goes in and beats Pitt, that would kind of be very telling to me. But I also think after, you got kind of an emotional hangover type game coming for Cal. So it's possible Pitt's rolling out the 6-0, and you kind of have to really wonder, are they that good? Are they, what are we learning about them? Some other games they have coming up the week after, they have a Thursday night game against Syracuse. I think that will be kind of telling.
Oh, yeah.
Then 11-2, they got the big game with SMU. So I think that will really give us a good idea of what these teams look like. But yeah, Pitt, just a team that I don't know where to put them because, again, they're 5-0, but it's like, are they actually legit 5-0, or have they kind of fumbled their way into a few things?
Yeah, I would be happy to be wrong. I'm not really picking on them, but I think they beat Cal at home. Like, as you alluded to, I'm not high on Cal, but then after that they go Syracuse at home, at SMU, Virginia at home, Clemson at home, and then to Louisville before closing at Boston College. They could lose 5 in a row. I don't think they'll lose all 5 of those, but I could see them dropping 4 of them. And 8-4 after last year would be great. So it's not a dig. That's why I'm a little hesitant to go ahead and I'm not jumping them over Louisville yet. I still believe in Louisville. But, of course, SMU makes the jump. Did you have eyes on that game?
I was able to get some of it, and while I was driving, was able to listen to get a bit of it on the radio. Okay. So, impressive stuff from SMU, a team that I think when I was guilty of this with everybody when they were announced as an ACC member, I kind of rolled my eyes and like, what are we doing here? They haven't been good since the 80s. They're not a team that we really, have considered to be our caliber, and yet they went into Louisville and shocked them, which, that very impressive. I'm very excited about what I'm seeing with SMU. They've got Stanford this weekend, who, as we're saying, not very good. It will be a trip out west. Good thing, though, for SMU, that's not the big body clock difference that it is for everybody else. It's an hour difference, I guess. So that will be interesting to kind of see, but it should be a team they roll over. And they'll have a fun kind of end to the season. They have Pitt, they'll have Duke, they have Boston College. Little disappointed that Clemson didn't get SMU in this first round, in this first roll of them in the ACC. Now, when the schedule came out, I was like, yeah, Stanford, that's perfect. I've always wanted to kind of watch more of Stanford just because they had some fun years under Jim Harbaugh. They had some fun years under David Shaw, but man, SMU looking really good, and a possible team that could be in the conversation for playing in the ACC championship now.
Yeah, I watched them early in the year against Nevada. I think that was a week 0 game, if I remember correctly. And then it was a loss to BYU. And I thought, this team's not that great. They're going to struggle in the ACC. And I think I was right in that they weren't that great. And they changed some things, right? They switched to Kevin Jennings at quarterback, who initially kind of inaccurate. He looked amazing against Louisville, running like dead sprint and then just frozen rope, hitting receivers in the hand. Huge threat on the ground, obviously, but pretty decent passer in that game. Offensive line, honestly, might be the biggest change, though. They were awful early. And whatever it is they did, they figured that out, that offensive line. They won the battle in the trenches on the road at Louisville, and that was a big part of the difference, was that and Kevin Jennings just being awesome. A bit of a wacky game, as there were some big plays that probably the DB should have limited to some extent. But nonetheless, it was a great back-and-forth game. I thought both teams, aside from that, looked good overall. That's why I'm not really hesitant to have them 3-4. And you started mentioning their schedule. I wanted to park on this for a second. So after that game on the 19th, so this coming weekend, or that's after an open date, then it's Stanford. Then after that, to Duke, who we don't have that high. They host Pittsburgh. That's a big one to have at home. That's tough, potentially. 22 ranked Pittsburgh. Then they host Boston College, go to Virginia, which could be tricky, and they host Cal, who you're high on potentially, but I'm not so high. That's all winnable. They could run the table. I don't think they'll be perfect, but it wouldn't be shocking. They should be favored in every game from here on out, especially with Pitt being at home. That could be real weird if they're undefeated.
Yeah, it really could. And from what I was reading today, if you get a situation where Clemson, Miami, and SMU are all undefeated, it then goes into like a third party, creates a team ranking, and they pick the two best teams that go to Charlotte.
Right. It's something like the SP Plus, but it's a predetermined, pre-agreed upon third-party analytics company, which I don't know how else you do it. It's that, or you go by rankings that the committee makes. So I'm not sure one's better than the other, but yeah, it goes by all these tiebreakers of who has a better win percentage head-to-head, but none of these teams play each other between Clemson, Miami, and SMU. Then it goes to common opponents, but if they're all undefeated, they all have a perfect, 1,000 win percentage. So yeah, it could come down to that. I'm sure between Clemson, SMU, and Miami, someone will slip up. But SMU is a legit championship contender right now, and I would say one of three teams that has legitimate college football playoff aspirations.
In the ACC, that if we do get in that situation, they've got to be hoping that Clemson's one of the teams, because we know Clemson sells out Charlotte. Miami doesn't always sell out their home stadium, and I don't know enough about SMU's fan base. It's just not a big school, so I think if you're the ACC, you're kind of hoping you at least have Clemson, and then one of these two little private schools can play Clemson.
Yeah, but if it's an objective analytics source, then that's not going to help. I have been to a game at SMU. This was 2017 because Clemson was playing Texas A&M the next day. So my sister lives in Dallas, so we stayed there before the A&M game. And it was SMU versus TCU. I think it was a Friday night, and it was real rainy, and there was no one there. It was us and some Australian tourists, and not a single TCU fan from Fort Worth, and just a real smattering of SMU fans. So now that they're really good and they're in the ACC, I think it's a different ball game. But that was my experience at SMU.
Yeah. Oh,
all right. Let's take a look here. I've had Miami first all year from the preseason, and even last week when they just about lost to Virginia Tech, and I have finally flipped them, putting Clemson first. Your reaction, and then maybe I'll explain after the fact.
This is one of those that I do agree with. I think Clemson is the better team right now. If I was doing this rankings, I don't know that I would have dropped Miami just because they are undefeated. And I think the other side of that is that Clemson didn't look particularly great this weekend against Florida State. If Clemson had gone into Tallahassee and won 42-7, then I'm like, yeah, I think clearly you put Clemson over it. Clemson did what they needed to do, and I made the comment, and I think this is a really big thing, is that it's nice that Clemson is back at a level that they can go on the road, play a C game, and still come away with a 16-point win. Like that's – I think people kind of forget that during the Deshaun, during the Trevor years, there was a lot of times Clemson didn't play well, but it just didn't matter because they were better. And that's kind of where Clemson, is right now. That it's kind of refreshing to be able to see that, because this is a game that had similar vibes to the Duke game last year. You put up a bunch of great stats, but you don't convert. You get 2 kicks blocked, and the fact that all that happens and you still win by 16, I still think that's great. You're a good team. Miami just a wild game at Cal, and I think while giving up 35 points and getting down like that is not a big showing to me that they're good, and the fact that you've had 2 weeks in a row that they've easily could have lost to a team that should not be as good as they are, and it's 2 weeks in a row that there's been questionable officiating. You really got to wonder with Miami, but it does also show a lot of grit and a lot of tenacity that they were able to come back down from 35-10, because Miami is a team that we always, especially a few years ago, there was questions of what's the culture like. Are these kids, that there was kind of thought that their NIL, they get a lot of kids that are coming to chase a check. And, when you have those kind of questions, you start to wonder when things aren't going well, how are they going to respond? And the fact that they responded to a 25-point deficit on the road in the biggest game in Cal Berkeley, possibly history, or at least in the lives of these students, is, crazy that they did that. So, I got to commend Miami for that. I do agree. I think Clemson is better right now. But it's definitely just they're both very good teams, and I think if this is the ACC championship matchup, it could be a very good game.
Yeah, and you know what? To the point of this commenter here, it might not be the ACC matchup. Miami has the toughest schedule left between Clemson, SMU, and Miami. They go to Louisville, to Georgia Tech, and to Syracuse. Those are three of the top half teams in the ACC. They're all on the road. They get Florida State, Duke, and Wake at home. If you're Miami, you wish those were flipped because those are probably wins regardless of where they are. I don't know, man. They could easily drop one, and SMU can drop one too. Maybe the tiebreaker will just be them. I say that, and I sound a little arrogant, but Clemson obviously could drop one as well. But it's not a cakewalk for them. To your point, Miami has they're number one in the nation in total offense. Cam Ward is maybe a little too risk-seeking, but no one's as dynamic of a passer, not a runner, but as a passer as he is, just zipping in dig routes across the middle of the field. He has no fear in firing those off. And so they needed 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. It was, let's see what the score was. Yeah, they had given up 35 at the time. They ended up giving up 38. 3 touchdowns fourth quarter, just perfect drives because Cam Ward's that good as a passer. So they win 39-38. Impressive. Also, that defense is not great. They haven't played at Georgia, so they're undefeated, but also their schedule's more backloaded. So I'd pick Clemson to beat them, next week if it was in Charlotte. So I'm going to go ahead and making the move and putting them number one. Thanks for everyone who's commented. I appreciate it. It's been fun chatting with you, Matt. And let's now shift gears. Let's go ahead and deep dive on the Clemson-Florida State game. So you mentioned that Clemson didn't look so good, and certainly has merit. They struggled once they moved the ball, but didn't cash in 7 field goal attempts, which is outrageous. 2 of them blocked, but made the other 5. So 5 made field goals was, the bulk of the story in the game, really. Just moving the ball at will and then not punching it in. In a way, I thought this was a better performance than last week against Stanford. Stanford, they won 40-14, but they allowed Stanford to run the ball at will on the edge, and then they just kind of hoped that for no reason at all, Stanford would decide to pass in the red zone, which they did, and they threw just silly turnovers, interceptions that were like any team would pick those off. They were just so bad. Obviously, Clemson has elite starting cornerback duo, which helps. But I thought this, in terms of they moved the ball at will, they didn't punch it in as much, but it wasn't so turnover aided or dumb decision aided. I thought they earned more, and I thought it was more impressive. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. And again, I think also just, going on the road is always going to be tough. And I had weird feelings about this game all week because everybody was saying, everybody's counting Florida State out. And, even with all the construction, Doak Campbell's still a tough place to play. So the fact that Clemson was able to go in, like you said, move the ball at will, come away with a 16-point win, I'm happy with that. The red zone play calling was a little just concerning because it's just it's something that we thought we had gotten past. We thought we'd gotten to a point where we weren't going to have these kind of issues, and they're kind of rearing their heads. But it will be interesting to see sort of what this offense, how they respond against Wake. Not a very good team, as we've talked about. And I think also a good thing to remember is this team's dealing with some injuries. And I don't think Brian Westco has been healthy. He didn't really have too many. I think he had 1 or 2 catches in this game. Great game from TJ Moore. He had an awesome touchdown. Tyler Brown, we're still waiting to kind of see him back. And obviously Antonio Williams is definitely the best receiver. Adam Randall, got to give a shout out to him. He was dressed and available to play in this game. They fortunately didn't need him, but that's really impressive from him to fight through that broken toe like he has. But I think when I look at it, the fact that Clemson was able to move the ball with a lot of the backups kind of in, that's a good sign. Again, frustrated with the red zone. Maybe I feel a little different if we don't give up the 2 block kicks, and this is this, instead of being a 16-point win, it's a 22-point win. Maybe my perception is a little different, but yeah, just it wasn't the best performance, but again, the fact that Clemson can kind of have an off game and still come away like that is very encouraging.
Yeah, I was encouraged that Peter Woods came back, limited snap count, but I don't totally credit Woods for this because Florida State's bad at running the ball just against everyone. But Clemson only allowed 22 rushing yards after what happened against Stanford. That was encouraging to see. It was 500 versus 250 in terms of total yardage. Really impressive for Clemson there. Just, thoroughly dominated in that regard, something they didn't do the week before. The offense was still explosive. First time they're doing it on the road in a neutral site against Georgia. They were not explosive. They had plays of 59, 57, 27, 25, and 24 to Josh Sapp on a ridiculous, you have almost no window play there. So still explosive. What stood out to me, and I'm curious if you picked this up, I imagine you'll agree, but I'm not sure how obvious this was. It was watching Florida State, even without DJ, looked exactly like our last 3 years watching Clemson. The receivers didn't get a lot of separation. The rare times they did, they dropped it. They have good running backs, but their offensive line can't rush block, so that's a waste. And their quarterback doesn't attack downfield a ton. Brock Len, I thought made some real NFL throws, but they tried to, go sideways more and take some pressure off him. But it was just like watching us and all the pains we went through now on our arch rival. I was like, this is kind of fun. And then we're the opposite. We're explosive again with all these big time plays, doing exactly what TCU did when Garrett Riley was there. It was just a weird, like, role reversal kind of thing that I enjoyed.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, FSU very similar offensively to what we had kind of gotten used to with Clemson. And I imagine with some of the play calling not attacking that deep as much, it's some of it just you got a young quarterback. This is his first start of the year. They probably called it a little bit more conservatively. We'll kind of watch Brock throughout the year and see what he does. But, man, they had some pretty bad drops and really some drops that they make it. Maybe this is a little bit of a different game, but just a team that can't get out of their own way. It seems like I was impressed. I know their offensive line ain't great, but I was impressed by what Clemson's defensive line did. I mean, the 22 rushing yards is impressive, and it seemed like almost any time they ran the ball, he was getting met at the line of scrimmage and, at best falling forward for a yard or two. But definitely just shut that down. And you hope to see a little bit, you hope to see the defensive backs get a little bit better. They had a few busts that led to some big plays. But, yeah, really, I mean, solid outing from the defense, definitely.
Yeah, speaking of that, I thought I know Sheldon Lewis a couple times just in the past couple of games getting beat, but I think Avion Terrell certainly, and also Jalen Lucas. That's an outstanding starting duo. Did you catch eyes on that?
Yeah. Lucas is great. Avion Terrell, I think, is going to end up finishing his career as one of the best cornerbacks in the country. I think he might actually be better than his brother. Just a really, really solid cornerback. I think, a lot of what we're seeing with some of the busts is just Clemson's got some young talent on defensive back. I mean, Shelton Lewis, only a sophomore. Sherrod Coval's a guy this is his first year getting a lot of big snaps. And it's like, I think you and I have talked about this in the past before. It's a weird time for Clemson because even your older guys that didn't necessarily who were backups the past few years, who didn't get a lot of snaps, it's not like it was in the old days where Clemson used to get, this year it is. The past 3 years were not like the old days where Clemson was getting all their backups, averaging like two quarters worth of snaps in a game because you're blowing everybody out. You've got pretty much an entire class that did not get that kind of, those kind of reps. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that. And now that Clemson looks to be back at this level and that we're seeing, against App State and against NC State, put in like over 90 players in each of those games. I think against NC, I think one of those games they even may have put in over 100. I hope that we can continue to see that. And I think that's going to be huge for continuing to rebuild this program back to what we expect, is that you have these guys that they've been here, maybe 2, maybe 3 years, that they've at least gotten, a lot of the reps. I think we're seeing some guys in that defensive backfield having to learn on the job a little more.
Yeah, I think I think it's pretty clear that getting those extra reps makes a big difference. I think it's huge, and I think it'll pay dividends moving forward. That's something that helps about being in the ACC. You're not grinding every week where your easier game is Kentucky, which is still going to be tough. Right now, your easier game is like Stanford, and you're able to get these guys experience that really pays off. Maybe one of the biggest things from this game or most encouraging things was the physical run game. Clemson, especially later in the game, just turned to Phil Mafah and said, can you just end this for us? And there wasn't a ton of explosive plays. It was just eating them up. And then towards the very end, there was the huge long run that sort of ended any hope that they had. But he came into the game with only 43 carries on the season for 342 yards, which is great. That's 8 yards a carry. But he had 154 yards on a season-high 25 carries. So now he's up to almost 500 through 5 games, which is almost 100 per game. So love seeing that from him.
Yeah, it's been a good year for Phil, but it feels like a quiet year just because I think everybody's talking about how much better the passing game is. Last year he was kind of the main show on offense, whereas it sort of feels like this season we've kind of overlooked him, but he's having a great year. As I said, kind of quietly a good year, and he was huge for Clemson in this game.
So let's quickly talk about Brock Glenn. You mentioned him a little bit in the ACC Power Rankings video. Folks who are not watching this live and watching this recording later, go check out the YouTube channel to watch those ACC Power Rankings. I thought he was good, man. I thought he's got to be your starting quarterback the rest of the year. I thought he showed a lot of moxie, a lot of guts, and made some NFL kind of throws. Did he impress you as much?
Yeah, I was very impressed, and I think if you're Mike Norvell, I think somebody needs to ask this question of when DJ started to struggle earlier in the season. I understand why DJ is your starter going into the season. He was a big time getting the transfer portal. I get that, but I think when he started to struggle, you kind of have to ask the question of, okay, why did it take him getting hurt before you finally put Brock Glenn in? When Brock Glenn looks better right now. I mean, he looks like a better quarterback and looks like, and I think the other end of that too is that you're building for the future. DJ does not have another year at Florida State, even if he, unless there's the red shirt and all that. But if he's your starter for the rest of the season, that's it. And at this point, you're not making a bowl game, so why not let this guy come in again, try to see if you pick up a few wins here or there, get some upsets, and build for the future, because I think Brock Glenn is a guy that could be a big factor for Florida State in the next few years. Yeah,
and coming into this game, I was kind of wondering, is DJ is this an injury that normally you would play through, but he needs to be benched, and they're kind of just being nice and saying he's too hurt to play. And then you see him in a pretty big cast, so I tend to believe it. But yeah, I mean, you can't go back to him. This season, all your goals are off the table now. The only thing to play for is building. It's almost like a pro sports team. Just get the draft pick, play young guys. It's almost, obviously you'd rather win in college sports. There's no draft pick, but you might as well make a youth movement and build those guys up. Because if the team's no good, and if you're going to leave because you're graduating or whatever, it doesn't really matter anymore, right? So couldn't agree with you more here. Kevin also agrees in the comments saying, yeah, Norvell has a lot to answer about in that QB position. Maybe a game or two late making the switch. Yeah, so impressive by him. So kind of to wrap on this, so after the win, Clemson went from 15th to 10th in the power rankings, jumping Missouri, Michigan, and Southern Cal or USC, who all lost. And then also jumping LSU and Notre Dame, who are off this week. I kind of think 10th, maybe I'd probably even have them as above Miami, obviously by my power rating. So I might even have like 8th-ish. I don't know that they would. I don't think I'd pick them to beat like a Texas or an Ohio State or a Penn State or a Georgia. Probably not Alabama. Maybe not Oregon, right? So I don't know if I'd put them that very top tier. But I'd pick them over Ole Miss or LSU or Notre Dame, maybe Tennessee, and I'd pick them over Miami or SMU in a championship game. So, I mean, that's like, they're a legit playoff team, and not just because of a weak ACC or some buys. Are you thinking of them in that same sort of tiering?
Yeah, and I think absolutely, especially when you see kind of how Tennessee's offense really got shut down by Arkansas, not a great Arkansas team. I think Clemson's better than them. I feel like 10. I think 10 makes sense when you see the way that the AP voters have voted throughout the year. I wasn't expecting us to go above 10, but I also think Clemson is probably better than 10th. I think, you start looking at 8th, 7th. Yeah, I think that's absolutely a conversation you have, because this is really a team that looks like a legit playoff team, looks like probably the best team in the ACC, and I think a team that, could really show a lot of teams, could really give a lot of teams fits in the playoffs.
Yeah, maybe the only team that I am a little bit bothered, not even bothered because it doesn't matter, but it's odd to me that they're behind Ole Miss, following Ole Miss's loss, and they don't really have, they blew out, but they beat a bunch of bad teams. No, I guess, Clemson could say the same, right? They blew out a bunch of mediocre teams, but their loss is to Georgia. So let's go ahead and end here on the Florida State. Let's go ahead and shift gears, and let's do a very brief preview of the Wake Forest game. So Wake Forest had the big rivalry win against NC State in Raleigh. So all of a sudden they're buoyed, their spirits are up just in time to host Clemson, which is just lovely. They were awful last year. I mean, they were just bad across the board. They came to Clemson. Clemson played like an F game and still won. One of the worst games I've seen Clemson play, quite frankly, and they still won because Wake was just completely hapless. Well, they got Hank Bachmeier from Louisiana Tech. Most people remember him from Boise State. He's been pretty good. They got Donovan Green back from injury to pair with Taylor Marin at wide receiver. That's a pretty good wide receiver core. The defense is bad. We'll talk about that. But it seems like they fixed the offense. Your thoughts on the matchup overall?
Yeah, and I think we need to reiterate with Wake Forest. I mean, they have a loss to Louisiana, not Louisiana State, not Louisiana Tech. Like the Raging Cajuns came into Winston-Salem and beat them. So they're really, they're a team that is struggling. I think this is very much a good opportunity for another sort of get right game for Clemson, where Clemson can really do some things, work on some things, get some young guys in. I imagine with Wake being down, it'll be kind of like it's been in years past, where we'll probably have half the stadium in orange. Definitely, I just think a huge opportunity more for Clemson to get better and to kind of get people a little more confident. I think you could see it, kind of like how you felt after the NC State game. You're like, man, this offense is really good. I think this could be another opportunity for that for Clemson.
Yeah, and to your point, so Clemson's defense, in terms of total defense, not points, only ranks 80th, 371 yards per game allowed. Not great. Wake Forest offense, 46th, which sounds only so-so, but when you're the upper half tends to be fairly close. 431 yards per game, pretty good. So you would think they could score, just by the raw stats, you think they could put up some points. But when you flip it over, Clemson on offense is 19th, 460 per game. That's great. And Wake's defense is abysmal, 124th in total defense, 460 yards allowed. So that is a bad defense. And to your point, they gave up 31 at home in a comeback victory for Virginia. They gave up 40 at home in a blowout loss to Ole Miss. They gave up 41 in a home loss to Louisiana. Just really, really bad. Even in their win at NC State, they still gave up 30 to a really bad NC State offense. So I think that is an opportunity for Clemson to put up like 50 on them.
Yeah, I really think this will be a good opportunity for Clemson to flex its muscles, have a little fun, and kind of after 2 weeks of not having your necessarily best offensive performances, this really could be a good opportunity to get back to that. Hopefully we get to see a lot of snaps for Chris Vazina. That's been very nice this year, getting to see him in that backup role continue to grow. Although he did get one snap in the Florida State game when Cade took the hit shot to the head, but hopefully we see that. I'm excited about seeing Jay Haynes continue to grow. I think because this is Phil Moffitt's last year, so Haynes is going to be probably your guy next year. So that's the thing with these games, that if it does turn into the blowout that we're thinking and kind of hoping that it is going to be, that's why I get excited about these games, is because all right, I get to see the future. I get to see I get to kind of get a preview of what we're going to look at next year. So excited about that. hopefully, again, it's a game where Clemson can kind of come in, do like they did against NC State, put up 28 in the first quarter, and never look back. And it should be that kind of game, hopefully.
Yeah, it's funny. 5 years ago, a lot of people were kind of sick of these games are totally non-competitive. Now it's like, I hope it's not competitive so I could see the backups, because that's fun too. So it's just funny how that perspective changes. A couple of final comments here. Hank Bachmeier, their new quarterback, he has 7 touchdowns to only 2 interceptions, 1,313 passing yards, 7.5 yards per attempt, pretty solid. Klubnik, a bit better, 14 touchdowns, only 2 picks, really, really impressive. So double the TDs for the same picks, 1,219 passing yards, but on fewer attempts. So he's averaging 8.5 yards per attempt, which is outstanding. He was just awful on yards per attempt last year, but he's just being so aggressive this year. It's a totally different quarterback. And then at running back, Maffa, 7.3 yards per carry with 2 touchdowns. Damon Claiborne, 471 yards in the year, averaging almost 6 yards a carry, and has 6 touchdowns. So I agree with you. Clemson's offense should just roll and put up 50. But let's see Clemson's defense is only 80th nationally in total yards against at least a decent offense. Claiborne's been good at running back. Bachmeier's been good at quarterback, and they've got good receivers. I tend to think that the slow mesh doesn't work well against really good defensive tackles, which Clemson has. So I'm not too worried about it. I think Clemson's going to shut it down, but it'll be a good test.
Yeah, I think the big thing I'm looking at, again, is just, you're right. They've got some talented receivers. How does our defensive backs respond after not their best game against Florida State? I think the defensive line, as we've seen in the years past against Wake and the slow mesh, shouldn't have too many issues. But that's really what I'm going to be watching. Is just, how these young defensive backs respond. Because that's what's going to be the difference between this being a 50-10 game versus a 50-40 game.
Yep. I agree. Hey, thanks for joining. I appreciate you. Folks can find Matt's work over at Shaking the Southland. Matt, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Always love to come on.
If you enjoyed this video, please help this channel by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Also, if you're a pet owner and you live in the upstate, check out our sponsor, Ready Vets. They offer immediate walk-in care when your pet can't wait. They're open 7 days a week till 10 p.m. They're owned by 2 Clemson grads. And they're located in Taylor's, just 10 miles from the Woodruff Road shopping district.